No one could have predicted the seismic shift that was about to shake the very foundations of political journalism. The air in the Meet the Press studio in Washington, D.C. wasn't just tense. It crackled with an almost visible electricity, a palpable anticipation that held every breath in the room. This wasn't going to be just another Sunday morning interview. This was destined to become a defining moment, a viral sensation etched into the annals of television history. Stepping onto the stage, a figure emerged who was both an enigma and a force. Karoline Leavitt. At just 27 years old, she held the unprecedented title of the youngest White House press secretary in history, a remarkable feat that spoke volumes about her sharp intellect and unwavering loyalty to President Donald Trump. Leavitt wasn't merely walking. She was a whirlwind in human form, a strategic mind with a razor-sharp wit, ready to sweep away any and all attacks that dared to cross her path. Her poised confidence was unsettling to those who underestimated her, a quiet strength that belied her years. She was a new breed of political operative, fluent in a language the mainstream media was only just beginning to comprehend. Across the expansive, brightly lit space, behind the transparent glass panels of the interview desk, sat Kristen Welker, NBC's veteran journalist, known for her incisive questions and unflappable demeanor, projected an image of professional calm. Her navy blazer was snug, her sharp eyes, though partially hidden behind a professional smile, betrayed a focused intensity. Welker was accustomed to controlling the narrative, to guiding conversations with a practiced hand. She had faced down countless politicians, grilled presidents, and navigated the choppy waters of live television with seemingly effortless grace. But today, she was about to meet an opponent unlike any she had encountered before. The interview promised to be not just a news segment, but the battle of the year. From the moment Leavitt leaned back in her chair, her white business dress exuding an almost defiant confidence, it was clear she wasn't there to simply answer questions. Her blonde hair, tied up high, swayed slightly as she tilted her head, a subtle movement that hinted at a mind constantly calculating, anticipating every move in the intricate chess game about to unfold. The cameras panned, capturing the silent, unrelenting face-off between these two formidable women. Welker began, with a gentle, almost friendly tone, a subtle velvet glove disguising the probing intent beneath. "Karoline, welcome to Meet the Press. As the youngest White House press secretary in history, working for a president like Donald Trump must be no easy task. How do you manage the pressure from the media, especially when the administration is constantly under scrutiny?" Leavitt's smile was subtle, her lips slightly curved, her gaze unwavering on Welker, a silent challenge. "Kristen, thank you. I'm honored to be here. Pressure? I see it as fuel. Working for President Trump means standing up for the American people who chose him to put America first. The media can criticize, but I'm here to ensure the truth is heard, not distorted by biased narratives." Welker nodded, but her eyes now, sharper, seemed to sense that Leavitt was not an opponent easily led astray. The stage was set. The first shots had been fired, and the audience held its breath, ready for the fireworks. Before we plunge deeper into this electrifying confrontation, make sure you don't miss a single moment of this historic event. Subscribe to our channel, like this video, and comment below where you're watching from. Your engagement fuels our mission to bring you the stories that truly matter. Welker, her professional smile now thinning at the edges, nodded as Leavitt spoke of truth. Her eyes, however, sharpened, betraying a veteran's intuition that this was not a typical interview. Leavitt wasn't an opponent easily led astray. She was a force. Sensing this, Welker pivoted, her voice shifting from cordiality to a laser-focused probe, aiming for the first critical hit. "You speak of truth," Welker began, her tone deliberate. "So let's dive into an issue drawing attention. Recent reports, including from NBC News, indicate President Trump hosted a dinner with investors tied to the Donald Trump cryptocurrency. The White House has refused to disclose the guest list, raising public concerns about transparency. Can you explain why the administration won't release this information and whether President Trump is prioritizing personal interests over national ones? The question landed like a shot, echoing in the suddenly tightening studio atmosphere. The audience, until now merely attentive, collectively held its breath, awaiting Leavitt's response. This was the moment of truth, the kind of direct accusation that typically put White House spokespeople on the defensive, forcing them to squirm. But Leavitt didn't flinch. She sat up straighter, her gaze locked onto Welker, her voice calm, but sharp as steel, cutting through the manufactured tension. "Kristen, I appreciate the question," Leavitt began, a faint, almost imperceptible curve on her lips, "because it gives me a chance to set the record straight. President Trump has been more transparent than any leader before him, with hundreds of pages of financial disclosures publicly available." She paused, letting the truth hang in the air. "The dinner you mentioned was a private event, entirely unrelated to public policy. Demanding the guest list is like asking you to reveal who attended your birthday party. Kristen, do you make that list public?" A ripple of chuckles spread through the audience, a few muffled claps breaking the silence. Welker, clearly unprepared for the sharp counterattack, took a visible deep breath. She tried to maintain her composure, but her fingers, now betraying her unease, began tapping rapidly on the desk. The facade of effortless control was beginning to crack. "Miss Leavitt," Welker pressed, her voice gaining a slight tremor that only a seasoned journalist, under immense pressure, could detect. "This isn't a birthday party. The Donald Trump cryptocurrency is a project in which President Trump has a direct financial interest. Reports indicate some guests are linked to companies under investigation. The public has a right to know if there's a conflict of interest, don't they?" Welker strained to regain the upper hand, but the pressure from Leavitt's unwavering confidence was palpable, suffocating. Leavitt leaned forward, her voice low but now undeniably commanding. "Kristen, if you want to talk about the public's right, let me ask you this. Why doesn't NBC spend time covering how President Trump has created 3 million new jobs in just months? Why not talk about how he's forced China and the EU to the negotiating table, saving Americans billions? Instead, you focus on unproven allegations based on stories even NBC can't verify. If you want transparency, start with your own newsroom." Leavitt's words cut like a blade, sparking a spontaneous burst of applause from the audience. Welker froze, her eyes flickering as if she'd been blindsided, visibly pushed onto the defensive. She tried to regain her composure, her voice firmer. "Miss Leavitt, our job is to ask questions, to verify the truth. If the White House doesn't disclose information, how can the public trust that no personal interests are being hidden?" But before Welker could continue, Leavitt cut in, her voice ringing out powerfully, each word a hammer blow. "Kristen, is your job to verify the truth or to craft stories to draw an audience? President Trump puts America first, and every decision he makes is for the nation's benefit. I'm here to defend the truth, not to play a game of chase with baseless allegations." The studio atmosphere was now electric, tension enveloping the room as the clash between Kristen Welker and Karoline Leavitt grew fiercer, undeniable. The power dynamic was shifting, unmistakably. The audience sat on the edge of their seats, whispers fading into a strained silence, all sensing the power dynamic shifting dramatically. Welker, still striving to maintain a calm exterior, found her tightly gripped papers betraying her unease. Her eyes, usually sharp and penetrating, now wavered between determination and a nascent anxiety as she prepared her next move, a desperate gambit to reclaim control of the narrative. In stark contrast, Leavitt radiated unshakable confidence, her posture relaxed yet commanding, like a chess master anticipating her opponent's every move. Undeterred by Leavitt's earlier counterattack, Welker leaned forward, her voice now sharp and deliberate, cutting through the studio's electric tension. Miss Leavitt, there's information suggesting the Trump administration ignored a Supreme Court order to return Kilmarago Garcia, a man deported to El Salvador due to what's been called administrative errors by the Justice Department back to the U.S. Critics argue this shows a disregard for the rule of law. Can you explain why the administration hasn't complied with this court order? The question landed like a bomb, precisely designed to corner Leavitt and paint the Trump administration as defiantly contemptuous of judicial authority. The studio audience held its breath, awaiting the young spokesperson's response. This was a direct challenge to the very foundation of American governance, and a typical spokesperson would stumble, perhaps equivocate. Leavitt didn't blink. Her gaze locked onto Welker with an intensity that cut through the studio lights. "Kristen, let's get the facts straight," she began, her voice low but razor-sharp. "Mr. Garcia's case is complex, and reducing it to a soundbite is unfair. The Trump administration respects the rule of law more than any recent administration. The so-called administrative errors is actually a consequence of the immigration system's chaos left by previous administrations. President Trump inherited that mess and is working to fix it." Leavitt paused, allowing her words to sink in before delivering the coup de grace. "As for the Supreme Court, no one is defying their order. But the reality is, El Salvador is a sovereign nation, and no U.S. court can force them to act. Suggesting otherwise is a serious misunderstanding." The audience erupted in light applause, some nodding in agreement as Leavitt's words systematically dismantled Welker's argument. Welker's lips tightened, her calm facade beginning to crack as she sensed the momentum irrevocably shifting to her opponent. She pressed on, her voice slightly higher, a hint of desperation creeping in. "Miss Leavitt, if I may interrupt, the Supreme Court's order was clear. The administration is responsible for bringing Garcia back. Failing to act, isn't that how President Trump sidesteps judicial authority? What message does this send to Americans about respecting the legal system?" Welker's words were resolute, but a slight tremor in her voice revealed her growing tension. Leavitt tilted her head slightly, a faint smile crossing her face, as if Welker had just walked into a trap. "Kristen, let me ask you something," she said, her voice soft but laced with intent. "When was the last time NBC covered how President Trump's policies reduced illegal border crossings by 40% in just months? Or how he's restructured legal immigration to protect American workers? Instead, you focus on a single case, inflating it to fit a narrative. The message President Trump sends to Americans is clear. He's protecting this country while dealing with a broken immigration system from before. If we're talking about the law, let's talk about the millions in taxpayer dollars spent on lawsuits like Garcia's, costs that shouldn't be necessary." The studio buzzed, applause growing louder, mixed with a few cheers. Leavitt's words hit their mark, flipping the narrative and unequivocally questioning the media's motives. Welker's face flushed, her fingers tapping rapidly on the desk, a clear sign of profound unease. She tried to regain control, her voice firmer. "Miss Leavitt, our job is to ask questions, to clarify the truth, not to praise any administration. Americans have a right to know why the administration hasn't taken concrete steps to comply with the court order. If it's not defiance, why hasn't action been taken?" Welker maintained a professional front, but her eyes briefly darted away, as if searching for an escape route that wasn't there. The battle was turning into a rout. Welker maintained a professional front, but her eyes briefly darted away as if searching for an escape Leavitt pressed forward, her voice lowering but brimming with authority, each word a direct challenge to the manufactured reality Welker attempted to present. Kristen, accountability is a great thing, but it needs to be applied fairly. The Trump administration is working within the framework of international law. The president can't force El Salvador to do what they don't want, just like NBC can't force viewers to believe reports that only tell half the truth. For instance, has NBC ever mentioned how President Trump's negotiations with El Salvador have significantly reduced gang violence spilling into America? Or how he's helping local communities thrive? Those are the stories Americans need to hear, not overblown claims meant to stir controversy. Leavitt's words landed like a punch, prompting another wave of enthusiastic applause from the audience. Welker clenched her fists, her eyes now betraying clear panic. She opened her mouth to retort, but Leavitt raised a hand, her voice ringing out like a command. "Let me finish. Kristen, Americans elected President Trump because they trust he puts their interests first, not to chase media narratives. If you want accountability, start by asking NBC to report honestly instead of cherry-picking to attack. That's the real question." Every word exchange between Kristen Welker and Karoline Leavitt now felt like a sword thrust, sharp and unrelenting. Welker, with a flushed face and wavering eyes, seemed to be teetering on the edge. Her hands gripped the stack of papers tightly, as if they were her last lifeline in the storm Leavitt was unleashing. But Leavitt, with unshakable confidence, sat relaxed, her eyes gleaming like a warrior certain of victory. The faint smile on her lips wasn't friendly. It was the mark of someone who knew they were dominating the game. Welker, though losing ground, still tried to regain control. She cleared her throat, struggling to keep her voice steady, but the tension was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Miss Leavitt, recently, President Trump made a shocking statement proposing to send American citizens deemed domestic criminals to foreign prisons, like those in El Salvador. This not only sparks controversy, but raises questions about legality and morality. Can you defend this proposal and explain how it aligns with the U.S. Constitution? Welker's question was a desperate gambit, aiming to box Leavitt into a corner and confront her with an unprecedented, contentious policy. The audience fell silent, awaiting the young spokesperson's response. Leavitt raised an eyebrow, her eyes flashing with a hint of delight, as if Welker had just handed her a golden opportunity. "Kristen, I'm glad you brought this up because it allows me to clear up a major misunderstanding," she began, her voice slow but commanding, each word carefully chosen. "First, President Trump never proposed sending American citizens abroad without due process. What he mentioned was a bold idea, exploring innovative solutions to address prison overcrowding and ensure public safety. He pointed to countries like El Salvador as examples of how tough governance has reduced crime. But let me be clear, every policy under President Trump adheres to the Constitution and prioritizes Americans' interests. Instead of criticizing new ideas, why not ask why previous administrations let our justice system become so overcrowded in the first place?" The audience erupted, applause thundering through the studio. Leavitt not only dodged Welker's attack, but turned it into an opportunity to defend Trump and critique past failures. Welker, clearly caught off guard by the pivot, tried to regain her footing. "Miss Leavitt, this idea isn't just innovative, as you call it. Legal experts say sending American citizens to foreign prisons violates the Eighth Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. How can you justify a policy seen as unconstitutional?" Welker's voice rose, almost sharp, but her eyes betrayed unease as Leavitt remained unflappably calm. Leavitt leaned forward, her gaze like an arrow piercing straight through Welker. "Kristen, I think you're misinterpreting President Trump's intent. And I'd be happy to clarify, she said, her voice low but brimming with power. No American citizen would be sent anywhere without full due process. President Trump is proposing a discussion on justice reform solutions, not a finalized policy. He wants to protect Americans from violent crime. And if that means learning from countries like El Salvador, where crime rates have dropped significantly due to strong measures, that's worth considering. But let me ask you, why doesn't NBC ever report that Trump's policies reduced crime rates in major U.S. cities by 25% last year? Why focus only on what's potentially controversial while ignoring real results? Leavitt's words were a tidal wave, sweeping away Welker's efforts and prompting another round of enthusiastic applause from the audience. Welker, now visibly on the defensive, tried to steady herself. She clenched her fists, her voice trembling slightly. Miss Leavitt, the press's job is to question policies that could impact citizens' rights. If President Trump is serious about justice reform, why not release specific plans instead of making shocking proposals like this? The public needs clarity, not vague statements. Welker tried to seize the initiative, but her confidence was shaken, and the audience could sense it through her repeated adjustments of her hair, a rare gesture for a seasoned journalist like her. Leavitt didn't give Welker a moment to breathe. Kristen, the public needs clarity, yes, but they also need a fair press, she shot back, her voice sharp as a blade, cutting through Welker's every attempt. President Trump has publicly committed to reforming the justice system, and details are being discussed with top legal experts. But you know what? Americans don't want to hear distorted stories meant to shock. They want to know their president is fighting to keep their streets safe, so their kids can grow up in a country not dominated by crime. If NBC truly wants to serve the public, report those successes. Talk about how Trump has lowered costs for Americans by cutting regulations and boosting economic growth. But instead, you chase sensational headlines. That's not journalism, Kristen. That's scripting for an audience. The audience's applause still echoed, but now all eyes were on Kristen Welker, who sat motionless behind the anchor desk. Her lips were pressed tight, her trembling hands clutching the table's edge, as if grasping for her last shred of composure. Her face was pale, her eyes wavering between panic and indignation, reflecting a veteran journalist facing an unprecedented defeat. Across from her, Karoline Leavitt maintained a deadly calm, her sharp gaze never leaving Welker, a faint smile on her lips like a silent declaration of war. The confrontation had reached its peak, and both the studio audience and millions watching on screens could feel it. A historic moment was unfolding. Welker, though on the ropes, made one final, desperate attempt to salvage the situation. She took a deep breath, her voice trembling, but striving for resolve. Miss Leavitt, let's address another concerning issue. President Trump recently criticized the Federal Reserve and Chairman Jerome Powell publicly, even threatening to interfere with monetary policy. Economists warned this could destabilize global markets. Can you explain why the president is taking such a confrontational approach and how he ensures the U.S. economy won't suffer? The question was thrown out like a lifeline, aiming to shift the conversation to a new topic where Welker hoped to regain control, but her eyes, now almost pleading, seemed to beg for Leavitt to slip up. Leavitt didn't move, her gaze dissecting every detail of Welker's face. Then she tilted her head slightly, her voice ringing out, low and certain like a speaker rallying a nation. Kristen, I appreciate the question because it touches on a core issue. Americans care about economic stability. President Trump isn't confronting the Federal Reserve out of personal whim. He's doing it because he sees a system failing to meet the people's needs. Under prior administrations, inflation soared, burdening working-class Americans with rising costs for everything, from groceries to energy. President Trump is calling for accountability, demanding the Fed act decisively to protect Americans' wallets. He doesn't want to control the Fed. He wants it to do its job. But let me ask you, Kristen, why don't you ask about how Trump's economic policies have driven a 15% stock market surge since he took office? Why not mention how he's lowered living costs for millions of families? Or are those stories not juicy enough for NBC? The audience erupted, cheers and applause roaring like a tidal wave drowning out gasps of astonishment. Leavitt didn't just answer the question, she turned it into an attack, flipping the script and putting Welker decisively on the defensive. Welker, now stripped of her professional veneer, stood up abruptly, pointing at Leavitt, her voice shrill and nearly out of control. "Miss Leavitt, you can't keep attacking the media to dodge questions. The public needs to know if President Trump is risking the economy by meddling with an independent institution. Can't you answer directly?" Welker's words were almost a shout, but they only highlighted her desperation. The audience began to murmur, some shaking their heads, sensing her profound loss of control. Leavitt sat still, her gaze unwavering, a monument of invincibility. "Kristen, I'm not dodging any question," she replied, her voice low but sharp as a blade. "I'm answering with the truth, which the public deserves to hear. President Trump isn't meddling with the Federal Reserve. He's calling on them to prioritize Americans over political games. And if you truly want the public to know the truth, stop turning his words into sensational headlines. Talk about how he's cut taxes for the middle class, putting billions back into American families' pockets. Talk about how he's building an economy workers can be proud of. But you don't, do you? Because those stories don't fit NBC's script." Leavitt's words were ablaze, incinerating Welker's efforts as the audience rose to their feet, applause and cheers thundering through the studio. Welker, now completely unraveled, stood frozen, her hands trembling, her eyes glistening as if holding back tears, but her indignation had crossed the line. "Miss Leavitt, I can't continue an interview where you only attack instead of answer," she shouted, her voice breaking. And in a burst of raw emotion, she threw her earpiece onto the desk, producing a sharp clack that echoed through the stunned silence. "We're done here," Welker declared, her voice faltering, then turned and stormed out of the studio, her hair whipping in the whirlwind of her emotions. As the Meet the Press studio door closed behind Kristen Welker's hurried figure, a stunned silence fell over the brightly lit space. The sharp clack of the earpiece hitting the desk lingered, mingling with the escalating roar of the audiences. Cheers, some standing and clapping relentlessly. Karoline Leavitt sat there poised and calm, her eyes sparkling as if she had just emerged victorious from battle. The faint smile on her lips wasn't arrogance, but the indelible mark of someone who knew she had just etched her name into television history. In that moment, the studio wasn't just a place for an interview, it was an arena, and Leavitt was the undeniable victor. The audience erupted, applause mixed with chants of "Karoline, Karoline." Some held up phones, recording as Leavitt stood, adjusting her vibrant red blazer, her gaze sweeping the crowd like a leader inspiring a movement. A middle-aged woman near the front row shouted, "She's right, the press needs to be fair." The support spread, leaving the Meet the Press production team flustered, frantically signaling to cut to commercial. But the moment Welker fled the studio had been witnessed by millions live, and the storm of reactions began spreading beyond the studio like wildfire. On social media, within minutes of the broadcast being cut, posts flooded in. An account with tens of thousands of followers wrote, "Karoline Leavitt just made Kristen Welker run from Meet the Press. This is why Trump needs her." The post quickly racked up thousands of likes and shares, trending at the top. Another user commented, "Welker couldn't handle the heat and walked out. Unprofessional. Leavitt a star." Trump supporters turned social media into a celebration, hailing Leavitt as a hero who exposed media bias. But not everyone agreed. One account criticized Leavitt just attacked instead of answering. Welker was right to leave. She didn't need to endure that rudeness. The online debate exploded, splitting into two clear camps. Meanwhile, at NBC News headquarters, chaos reigned. Producers scrambled into an emergency meeting, trying to manage the fallout from the unprecedented event. A stressed executive demanded, "The team prepare an official statement." Hours later, NBC posted, "Meet the Press is committed to delivering fair and insightful dialogue. We respect the role of journalism in asking tough questions, and Kristen Welker demonstrated professionalism in a challenging situation. We will continue our mission to provide accurate information to the public." But the statement only fueled the fire. Leavitt's supporters fired back, calling it a weak excuse and demanding NBC apologize for anti-Trump bias. One user wrote, "NBC calls that professional?" Welker walked out because she couldn't face the truth Leavitt laid out. Welker became the focal point of criticism. Some NBC colleagues quietly expressed sympathy, but others worried her actions had damaged the show's reputation. A veteran producer whispered in a meeting room, "Kristen's a great journalist, but today she met an opponent who was too strong." Online, conservative audiences branded Welker's exit cowardly, while her supporters argued she was right to walk away from a toxic interview. One post read, "Welker didn't need to endure Leavitt's personal attacks. She left to preserve her dignity." But these defenses were quickly drowned out by the wave of praise for Leavitt. In the studio, as Welker left, the crew rushed to cut to commercial, but the audience's eyes remained glued to Leavitt. She stood shaking hands with a few crew members, her unshakable confidence intact. A young audience member near the front shouted, "She's incredible!" Leavitt smiled, giving a slight wave, prompting another round of cheers. As she left the studio, she received messages from Trump's team, informing her that clips from the interview were going viral, amassing millions of views in minutes. Leavitt didn't just defend Trump. She became an icon of a new political generation, ready to challenge mainstream media. Meanwhile, Welker, though a respected journalist, faced unprecedented backlash. NBC, despite efforts to control the narrative, couldn't stop the social media storm. The moment of Welker storming out became a symbol shared, analyzed, and debated. Across America, the storm from the Meet the Press showdown didn't fade after the studio lights dimmed. What transpired between Karoline Leavitt and Kristen Welker transcended a typical interview, becoming a cultural event, a political flashpoint that shaped how the public viewed both the media and the Trump administration. The image of a composed Leavitt facing a rattled Welker became iconic, a story retold, analyzed, and debated across America, leaving profound consequences for both women and the broader political landscape. At just 27, Leavitt was not just the White House press secretary. She was a model for a young generation of politicians who understand that in the digital age, power lies not only in boardrooms, but also in posts, videos, and hashtags. Her journey from intern to powerful spokesperson is a testament to the strength of persistence and loyalty. She didn't just defend Trump, she inspired millions of Americans, especially the young, to stand up against what they see as media injustice. Analyses and outlets like Politico and The Hill began calling her the future of the Republican Party, predicting she could go further, perhaps to a Senate seat or even a larger role in national politics. For Welker, the event was a professional scar, but also an opportunity for reflection. Despite heavy criticism, she remained a talented journalist, and those close to her at NBC said she was quietly working to regain her confidence. In subsequent interviews, Welker focused on policy issues rather than personal confrontations, as if trying to avoid repeating the Leavitt scenario. But the event left a larger question for journalism: how to balance asking tough questions with maintaining public trust. Journalism workshops at universities like Columbia and Northwestern began using the interview as a case study, discussing how the media can adapt in an environment where audiences are increasingly skeptical. Some young journalists argued Welker was right to walk away, seeing it as a way to preserve dignity in an unwinnable argument. Others contended she missed a chance to push back harder, to prove journalism can stand firm under pressure. The clash between Karoline Leavitt and Kristen Welker on Meet the Press deeply reflected the polarization and tension in American society. Today, where media, politics, and the public frequently collide, forever altering the landscape of political discourse. If this deep dive into a truly historic moment captivated you, don't miss out on future analyses. Like this story, share it with those who need to hear the truth, and comment your thoughts below. Most importantly, subscribe to our channel to stay at the forefront of the most impactful stories shaping our world.